The problem is I didn't have the button turned on. It's kind of like secret password, you know. The password is Benjamin's an idiot. So, he did not turn on his microphone. I hope the folks at home can hear me right now as we're... Congratulations, everyone, joining us out there in YouTube. In 15 seconds, we are ready for launch here in the Odd class. I'd like to welcome all of our folks in Arizona joining us an hour from the past. We wished we could join you. Yeah. Welcome. Welcome to the fourth lesson of the Odd class. Welcome to Daylight Savings Time. There, we've said it. This is our class on the 6th and 5th century BC. This is the history of God's people after the exile and then their return. And let me bring you this timeline that we developed from last week. Things change for the Judeans, for the Israelites who are in captivity because of the Babylonian invasion in 597. Things change when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon in 539 at the Battle of Opus, and he creates edicts that set these people free and sends them home. So you can see that red line is their exile. It ends as Cyrus the Great takes over the Babylonian Empire, and shortly after that, with some pushing from the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, they rebuild the temple. This is done under Zerubbabel and Joshua, the leader and the high priest. Sometimes you'll see Joshua's name spelled Jeshua. It's the same thing. Now, period that we're looking at is a generation or two later, and during the reign of Artaxerxes over the Persian Empire. Ezra journeys back to Jerusalem. He's coming out of Babylon. He was a resident of Babylon, taken there by exile, and probably a second, maybe a third generation resident, that it might have been his parents or his grandparents that were exiled over there. So he grew up in Babylon and learned to be a scribe and a priest. So he was part of the keepers of the tradition and the keepers of the Torah for the people in Babylon, and that's how they held on to their identity. Nehemiah, on the other hand, is in the capital of the Persian Empire, a city called Susa. And there he is very close to Artaxerxes, the emperor of most of the world in 445 BC. When you start off in Nehemiah and you look at the first chapter, Nehemiah 1, he starts off with the problem that he's facing, and that chapter ends with a very poetic line: I was cupbearer to the king. And in Nehemiah, let me find Nehemiah 1 for us. Yeah. Nehemiah dates a lot of what he's doing and when it takes place. He says, in the month of Kislev, and you will need a comparison calendar with the Jewish calendar months. Kislev is approximately November, December on our calendar. It kind of overlaps those 2 months. But it's at that point in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, which puts us in 445 BC, 445, 446, more or less. And he says at the end of chapter 1, after he shares his grief over what's happened back in Jerusalem. And here he is, a servant in the court of Artaxerxes, and he says, I was the cupbearer to the king. Cupbearer is more than head butler. We see cupbearer in history. We see it in the text in the Bible. Joseph encounters a cupbearer to the Pharaoh. The cupbearer has a very important role in the king's inner circle. Not only is he there for ceremonial purposes where he serves cups of wine, and that, again, that can be a very big honor if the cupbearer shows up and he serves a cup of wine on behalf of King Artaxerxes to some other dignitary, then that means something. Everything that if he brings Artaxerxes his wine from someone else, that means something. But he also has to make sure that that wine is not poisoned. So not only is he a high-ranking official, he's trustworthy. He has to be considered reliable. He has the king's life in his hands, and he has to be able to secure that. So here you have an individual who has certain qualities. He's trustworthy. He's focused on security. He's smart. He notices what's going on. And he's experienced in diplomacy with other rulers because he's going to see Artaxerxes. And remember, Artaxerxes has an empire where he deals with secondary rulers across his empire. And he's going to be dealing with them quite often. So Nehemiah is going to have some sense of what's going on in the empire and how things work. So when Nehemiah says, I was cupbearer to the king, read that with a lot of charge, because he's saying, I was this close to the king. And literally, he was. And that's where the conversation begins in Nehemiah 1. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. You know, he's back in Susa. He knows now since at 538, since, I mean, that's almost 100 years ago, almost a century ago. This project of sending people back and rebuilding Jerusalem has been going on. He's asking, what news of Jerusalem? What news of what's going on over there? How are the people doing? Is our homeland, is the promised land, is it thriving again? And they said, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. That's not the news that Nehemiah wants to hear. Sounds like the project has failed. Pay attention to the opening line. Those who survived the exile are now in a situation even worse because their lives are threatened. They have no protection. They're in trouble. They're in distress. We could lose the whole thing, Nehemiah, is what his brother is saying here. So we've got our level 3. We've moved up to level 3 in our project to return to the promised land. Mission objective number 1 is we've got to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. That provides defense for the city. Every city over there has some measure of defense, but Jerusalem is really in the sights. You're going to see there's a lot of the other districts that have been over there longer. They've been in place for a lot longer, and the presence of Jerusalem and the Persian district of Yehud, it threatens them. They don't want another ruler on their land. We're going to have to resist opposition and aggression from surrounding districts like Samaria and Ammon, even the remnants of the Philistines out on the coast. We're going to have to implement just and fair economics for sustained growth. If they came over there in 538, the people that were in exile, and it is now 445, you can't blame all of that collapse on the people outside. There had to have been something going on inside that contributed to that deterioration. And that is also examined by Nehemiah. Unfortunately, I don't know about you, but I think we often overlook what Nehemiah does. But it's in Nehemiah chapter 5. I think he addresses the internal problem that leads to the worsening of the external problem. We've got Nehemiah. He mentions his brother. He mentions another person, Hananiah, and they actually become his successors. They brought him the news, and then they will become his lieutenants. It's the briefest mention in the later chapters of Nehemiah, but they're there. So here's our empire again, and understand this time we're bringing Nehemiah and his party not from Babylon right here, the capital city of this Babylonian empire, which now is definitely absorbed into the Persian Empire, but he's coming from Susa, over here where the Elamites are, which is and the Medes, and so all of these have combined for generations now, and Susa is the capital of this Persian Empire, and so it's from there that we're going to send Nehemiah back to this growing, emerging Jerusalem, which seems to have trouble emerging from its renewal. Artaxerxes is a Persian king who did not do like his father Xerxes and keep trying to expand the borders of the empire. Instead, he took more of a strategy of defending the borders that he had. Xerxes got into some battles with the Greeks, and those did not go well. So Artaxerxes' strategy seems to be, well, we'll protect our borders, and we'll cause all kinds of problems for the Greeks. And one of the ways that you protect the borders is you need to make sure that those kingdoms that border on that western side of the Persian Empire, let's go back and take a look at that. See, over here is Greece. That's where your Athens, Sparta. Here's where the 300 Spartans are that take on Xerxes. See, instead of trying to go up this way into Europe and invade, instead, Artaxerxes wants to make sure that he doesn't lose any territory. So you're going to build up fortifications and defenses along here. Because one of the things that they're facing too about this time in the Persian Empire, there have been revolts. There have been revolts around Egypt. There have been revolts just about everywhere, really, but out and along this route right here. And even some of these Greek cities up here were revolting. And you need to fortify things and put your best people in there to keep all that under control. So even from a political standpoint, it makes sense for Artaxerxes to commission Ezra. I decree that any of the people of Israel in my kingdom, including the priests and the Levites, may volunteer to return to Jerusalem with you. I and my council of 7 hereby instruct you to conduct an inquiry into the situation in Judah and Jerusalem based on your God's law, which is in your hands. We also commission you to take with you silver and gold, which we're freely presenting as an offering to the God of Israel who lives in Jerusalem. You can look at that and say, wow, that Artaxerxes, what a guy. He's giving money to this project. He's just freely turning over money to the God of Israel who lives in Jerusalem. That's really respectable. And you know what? Maybe that's all there is. If you want to be a little cynical, you could look at it and you could say, well, now, Artaxerxes may not have been a respecter of Yahweh in particular. He may have wanted every god out there to be on his good side, and he probably wanted to fund projects that would create some loyalty and some goodwill. I imagine the Jewish leaders look at it as, well, okay, if he does fund this and there's goodwill and he doesn't interfere with what God's will is, in fact, what if he's doing God's will by doing that? Fine, we'll do this. We know what God wants us to do. So Artaxerxes is commissioning these groups to go and do these things that are good for the empire and good for them. His commission of Nehemiah takes on a much more personal tone. Nehemiah records it like this. By the way, I've told you before, I've said that, look at the book of Ezra as like a file folder, and there's a lot of letters and documents and different records that are in there, and then some narrative. Nehemiah instead comes to us very much like a diary, okay? It is It is a leader's account, a personal account of what happened. He includes the dates, he includes the records, but it's much more his own chronicle of what is happening. And he does share some personal reflections like this one. He's in Susa. He's serving the king. He's the cupbearer to the king. The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked him, "How long will your journey take?" Oh, and by the way, there's a discussion before this where he says, "Why are you so down, Nehemiah?" He notices it. And Nehemiah takes a risk and says, "How can I not be down when I'm worried about my people suffering back in Jerusalem?" So the king grants him the opportunity to go back and help his people. Now, that means the king is giving up not just a bunch of silver and gold, which probably to him is not a big deal, but he's giving up someone that he trusts greatly, someone that he is vested in. So he's going to allow this to happen. That's quite profound. He says, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time." I'm going to assume that the time is 12 years because that's what it ends up being. "I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates," that's that satrap district that's out there, "so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he'll give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence that I'll occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me." Now, do you remember, this is different than Ezra. Ezra refuses the military support. Ezra, for that first wave that goes back, they have to do this as an exodus with only God to protect them. Now that that's been accomplished and the temple has been built, Nehemiah can come to Jerusalem as their kinsman, but how he travels and with what support he is given, that's not an issue. Besides, where Nehemiah, this time period that Nehemiah is going, there have been revolts, there have been actions against the Persian Empire. It's probably much more dangerous than it was nearly a century earlier. That's just an assumption on my part. But Nehemiah has no problem bringing that army support with him. And in fact, it's what Nehemiah is going to teach his people to do. We read about the opposition, and here's the breakdown of that district right around Jerusalem. You can always look for your call it the Holy Land geography, where you have the Dead Sea and you have the Sea of Galilee and Jordan River running between them. That little area right there becomes the backbone of all this. I mentioned that these maps, they come from a website called Know Your Bible, and I recommend that website. He's made some great maps here. Here's Judah in green right here with Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is we're trying to rebuild this. The Persians call that Yehud. And all around us are the historically connected kinfolk of the Israelites, okay? So these, sometimes this is seen as, okay, here's the people of Judah, here are the Israelites, and then you've got all these foreigners around them. No, it's not like that. These are people they know quite well. The way we might understand the tension is our problem's usually not with people who are on the outside, people who are absolute strangers. We all talk about that. Well, I don't know, these people are moving in from other countries and stuff like that. And then we find out they're great people, and we think, well, you know what, that's great. I'm glad they're here. They're bringing their culture. This is good stuff. No, the people we have problems with are the next door neighbors. Problems we have, the people we have troubles with are our cousins. If you live over to the west of us, you know how it is. Oklahoma versus Texas, And there's not a penny's worth of difference between the two of them, but you can't tell them that, Oh, now, that's not true. They're very different. No, they're not. And that's the ones we feud with. Well, it's the same way here. The Samaritans, especially, are the descendants of the tribes that lived in the north and the Assyrians. Now, they've got roots. They've got history. But that's enough for the Judeans to say, that's a problem because you represent a break in what God's plan was. And we can't rebuild the temple in Jerusalem if we end up just like you. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't be God's plan. And then there's some ancient problems with the Moabites and the Ammonites. These are the people, they share history and land with them. These are the people that they have problems with. Now, you could rightly argue that the Phoenicians are totally different. You know, there's no they're going out to sea every other weekend. There's no telling what they're bringing back. But but you know, that's okay. They're not the Phoenicians. They don't even worry about the Phoenicians so much. But here's the Philistines down here, or their relations. Samaria becomes the real issue, and this is the beginning of that Samaritan-Jewish tension. What comes up in the scriptures with Jesus, this is the historical issue that Jesus brings up when he tells the parable of the man who found himself in the hands of thieves on the way from Jericho to Jerusalem, and the one who came along and saved him, who was it? It was a Samaritan, not a good Samaritan, because no one in Jesus' listening audience would have said that a Samaritan is good. This rivalry is so tense, and over this period up to the time of Jesus, it gets even worse. And it is, and I'm going to tell you, nobody comes out of this, pure and sincere. Oh, they're both nasty. This is an ugly feud. Yeah, and Danny, it's what we would call a domestic. It's a domestic, okay? Nobody likes those in law. We don't want this. So anyway, this is rough, and it's hard to figure out what we're doing. But this Sanballat, okay, he's the governor, the head of that district. And remember, all the guys in the district, they answer to a satrap who answers to the emperor. Sanballat the Horonite, and I know you're like, wait, isn't he a Samaritan? Yeah, this is another way of saying it. We won't get into what that's all about. But when you hear Sanballat, think of Samaria. Tobiah the Ammonite, you see him next door in the kind of the mustard yellow, okay? And the official, or Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab, who comes from the south and the east and those tribal groups out there. They heard about what was going on. They heard that they were going to build the wall, and they mocked and they ridiculed us. What is this you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? Their accusation is, what you're doing is rebellion against the king of Persia, and we're going to tell him because we don't like this. And you remember what Nehemiah has? He has letters of commission. So there's no way this can be true. Nehemiah answered, saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. This, from Nehemiah then, gives us what the Samaritan and the Ammonite and even some of the others, what their concern is that they claim that they have this district and they want it. But he's saying you don't. Now, they have just moved into town and taken territory that they think belongs to them. Here's Jerusalem, and here's what's going on. If you look at Jerusalem from the sky, this yellow patch is what's called the Old City of Jerusalem, which for us is a bit of a problem because it's actually what's going to be there after Nehemiah, but it's called the Old City of Jerusalem because people now look back and call it the Old City. But it's that little dog leg that I want us to look at, because that dog leg represents a kind of a mountain with a little extension on it, all right? So we'll see it in 3D here in a second. But this is the Temple Mount, and then it starts to taper off, but there's a valley here and there's a valley over here. And this little extension, this little peninsula that sticks out here, it's often called the City of David, that little peninsula hanging off there. and it kind of slopes down, but it's on a hill. So if you can fortify it and it's on a hill, that's a great place to have a protected, fortified city. Now, Nehemiah is going to tell you how they rebuild that wall that you see in red. And all of these maps are going to have different things, like the prison gate. Well, that's a new one. Sometimes they have different names, but there's going to be the sheep gate should be up here, then the fish gate, then the old gate, then the valley gate, the fountain gate. There's a water gate. Yeah, there's actually a water gate, and they got rid of it because people kept breaking into it. Don't you? That was for, never mind. Okay, so anyway, you have the horse gate, and then all of those gates that are up there and the walls that connect them. How are you going to get all that built? Well, Nehemiah 3 describes and lists the work projects contracted by the various leaders. And the description begins with that sheep gate up in the north next to the temple. And it's interesting that in Nehemiah 3, it is the Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. The leaders take the lead. The high priest and his people, everybody's getting their hands dirty on this wall project. That's what's so exciting about it. They're not doing this by contracted labor. They're not doing this by employing some kind of, indentured servitude or slavery or anything like that. Everybody's getting their hands dirty, and it starts with the high priest. And so Nehemiah 3, he records it. Now, if you can reference a map like this or some similar map, and they're out there, there's plenty of them out there, Nehemiah's description is going to go counterclockwise from the sheep gate that will be right up in here, and it's going to go counterclockwise down the wall and then back up. And he's going to talk about each gate and the sections in between and who was responsible for them. He's keeping good records. So you start with the sheep gate, and I think right here, yeah, they have it. There's the prison. There's the sheep gate right there. Okay. So that's the key, and then from the sheep gate, you move on through chapter 3. He'll mention the fish gate, and then he'll mention the valley gate. Oh, I think the old gate is somewhere in there too. It's also called the Jeshana gate, or sometimes the names are translated a little differently. But all of the sections of the wall and the gates where and gates are always defensive positions where you control access into and out of the city, and they're vulnerable, because they're usually made of wood. You can burn them down, but you also put guard posts next to it so that you can protect it. So that if somebody comes up and tries to knock it down, you've got people right there. Anyway, it's very interesting how Nehemiah records all of this and who it was that was responsible for that. And you see a fantastic diversity of people working on it. Let's see. There's one I wanted to show you. I can find it. Oh, yeah. 3:12. Shallum, son of Halohesh, ruler of a half district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section, and he actually means after the Tower of the Ovens, which is like right over here somewhere. Anyway, he did it with the help of his daughters. It's like everybody is pitching in. He's got his daughters out there working for him. Girls can build walls too. There you go. There's your moment. And so anyway, they're probably pretty good. But all of these different works, you just read through chapter 3, and it might make it a little less boring, if you can map that out on a map and see who's doing what. But we have everybody working on it. Here's your 3D. This comes from same guy that did this. It's a guy named Rittmeyer, Lev Rittmeyer, who's archaeologist, and he had these CAD drawings done up. But you can see here's the valley, the Kedron Valley. You've heard about that. This becomes a hill, and this is a terraced hill, and so you put your walls up along the way there. You've got the temple up on the highest spot, and then you build your city in here down at the lowest point, and you have all of your gates so that you can get to whatever it is that you need. This is the project that they're going to be working on. So Nehemiah 4, we have the opposition. Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, and he became angry, and he was greatly incensed. He first shows up, and he says, don't even get this thing started. He says, I've heard what you're planning to do. It's a rebellion. If you put up fortifications, that represents rebellion. Nehemiah says, you don't know what you're talking about. We've got a commission to do this. God's going to give us a success. Now they hear that the construction has begun. So they show up to create a problem. Their first weapon, ridicule. This is still politics today. You don't want something to pass? Make it look like a foolish enterprise. Shame them into giving up. So Sanballat and the others are showing up, and they're like, this is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard of, building a wall out here. My goodness, how are you going to build a wall? This doesn't make any sense. You don't even have builders. Your people are a mess. I mean, look at this fellow over here, Nehemiah. He's one of your leaders, and he's got his girls out there building the wall. Come on, Nehemiah. That's their approach. And in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he ridicules them. I mean, you don't waste good ridicule in private. I mean, this is the 5th century BC version of a press conference. Come out there. I'm outraged. I'm outraged that the leader of one of the districts is doing this foolish project. Why? I just think this is doomed to failure. And how much is this going to cost the emperor of Persia? I would like to know. So. What are those feeble Jews doing? Notice the name calling. Will they restore their wall? I mean, this is almost like a rally. He's like, will they restore their wall? And you can imagine there's a bunch of people out there, no! And will they offer sacrifices? No. Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble? And you got to look at it from their perspective. There's trash everywhere. This thing has been torn down. It's been leveled. Nobody wants this city of Jerusalem there because it's a threat. And it's like, how are they going to do this? Tobiah the Ammonite. Now, I like Tobiah. Keep an eye on Tobiah, okay? I like him because he's kind of a sad, tragic figure. He's Sanballat's sidekick. And he's not nearly as good as Sanballat, okay? So he's always showing up, always causing problems, but he's also trying to get in good with the Judeans at the same time. We'll come back to Tobiah. But when Sanballat issues the big press release, here comes Tobiah to make a lousy joke about it. Tobiah, who was at his side, said, what they're building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down the wall of stones. And I imagine that when he says that, there's silence out there like, was that supposed to be a joke? A fox, really? A fox? And so he's trying to make it real funny and everything, and he's not that good. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and now we bring in the people of Ashdod, everybody around them is getting threatened because now it's not just a talk about project, now it's something real. And in fact, you can see where Tobiah messes up because Sanballat is making a point. He's like, these Jews are weak. They can't do this. Are they really going to restore their wall? Are they really going to? No, that would never happen. That would never happen. Can they bring the stones back to life? That would never happen. Tobiah's statement is more or less, yeah, you see how far they're coming along on that wall? I mean, they're about halfway there and everything, but it's not very good. Shut up, Tobiah. You're acknowledging that they're getting work done. Now everybody's concerned, so they're plotting together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble. Insults didn't work. Now we've got to do something. So here's Nehemiah's strategy. Long section here in Nehemiah 4, but I want you to, this is the way Nehemiah works and the way Nehemiah thinks. So I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places. That's your weak point. That's where you would send people in and breach the wall. Posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. They're organized. They have weapons. After I looked things over, I stood up and I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives, and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of the plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. From that day on, Half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I also said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day. Neither I nor my brothers nor my men nor the guards with me ever took off our clothes. Each had his own weapon, even when he went for water. He's saying we were in uniform the whole time. And even when we took personal breaks, we were armed. We were ready for anything. Nehemiah's strategy, to boil it down, first, he switched shifts. He has them working, he has them guarding. They are working together, both are of equal importance. He is then in a position of patrol. He's always watching the status. And he has a trumpeter. And that trumpeter this is the early warning system. He's doing his own communications, observation, surveillance. If the trumpet blows, you go to that location and you fight off an attack. And the people are always armed. They're always on alert. This is what it takes to get the job done in 52 days. But now, along the way, we have in Nehemiah chapter 5 this mention of a problem. You've got these people armed, you've got these people working, but people are starving. Okay, this is that internal problem that he has to deal with along the way. In 5:1 he says, now men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, we and our sons and our daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. Others were saying, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. And that, if they put a siege up around Jerusalem, then that could make this even worse. Still others have said, and this is the worst one, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. And although we're of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we're powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. This is more than just economic problems. This is more about what should the interest rate be at the Fed. This is the kind of economics that creates human abuse. Nehemiah sees this, and so he says I want to pick up in this passage here in verse 14. First of all, he convinces the nobles. He convinces the ones who have the land. He says, look, we need to start practicing some of that stuff that Moses taught us about. And he's asking them to make a sacrifice for the good of all. And he says, I want you to give back this land that you hold in trust. I want you to give back this land that you hold to your indebted brothers and sisters. We've got to do this because this isn't about making a profit. This is about survival. So he encourages them to do that. Verse 11, give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you're charging them. 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. They say, we'll give it back, and we'll not demand anything more from them. We'll do as you say. By the way, if they do that, then those people start farming, and then there's food, and then they share the food. All ships are going to rise under Nehemiah's plan. From the time King Artaxerxes appointed me as their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th to the 32nd year of his reign, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers used the governor's food allowance. That means that Nehemiah and his men, his brothers, his fellow associates, they had permission by the king to levy a tax on the people to provide for themselves. You know, it's not a lot different than what the Romans will do with the tax collectors. where the tax collectors will gather tax from the people and then give it to the Romans. And if along the way they line their pockets with some of that, well, that's just the way tax collecting works. Nehemiah is saying that he and his people refused their right to do that for the sake of all. And he wants that to be remembered. He puts that in his diary, and he wants God to see that. Not only is he setting an example, but he knows that this is what he needs to do. So the governors who had preceded me, he says, oppressed the people by taxing them 40 shekels of silver a day for food and wine, while their underlings bullied the people unmercifully. Where did the people get 40 shekels of silver a day? The answer is they didn't. They didn't, and so it became debt. I love it when credit card companies say, hey, look, if you're paying your bills on time, everything's fine. If you get behind, we're going to jack your interest rate up to about 70%, and we want you to pay that too. In other words, we know you can't pay, so we're going to charge you more. Oh, that makes sense. And it just drives debt, further along. Nehemiah changes all this, and they did not have time to line their pockets. They did the work. Real quickly here, Nehemiah resists distractions and smears. I'm going to pick this up next week. We've got one more lesson. We'll do this next week. The good news right now is the wall is completed in 52 days. The poor and the indebted Judeans are allowed to prosper. That helps everybody in this fortified city. Nehemiah has equipped his people to withstand opposition by obedience and trust in God. And after 12 years, Nehemiah has got them set up. His brothers have seen what he's done. He can appoint one of them as governor, and he can go back to Susa. And he does. But then he comes back. That's right. I don't know if you knew this, but Nehemiah goes back to Persia. He has to come back for an encore because there's still some problems, and one of them happens to be our old friend Tobiah. And, tune in next week for, what shall we call it? Tobiah's harsh punishment. Yeah, something like that, the end of Tobiah. But thank you for your attention this morning, and keep reading Nehemiah, and we'll wrap things up next week. Yeah.